Hey everyone, Seth at Hub City Vintage, and today I'd like to address a question we get asked fairly often regarding the yellow dialed 6139 600Xs. Specifically, why and how they develop dark rings around the sub-register and why those dark spots develop elsewhere as well. I've got several examples in hand today to share and to help you get a better handle on this issue and how and why it happens. Not to mention some bonus content just for our Patreon crew, featuring a look at a very special Pogue dial right after the end of this video. So let's start by talking a little bit about how this dial is constructed, and I think that'll help shed some light on this issue. Turning it over, we can see a couple of things. Likely what stands out the most is the stamping here. Like the case back, most dials are marked with their date of production, and here we can see a 2 and a 6, and that translates to 1972 and of course June of that year. More importantly, we can see that it's mostly silver in color, but where the silver has been worn away from finishing work, we can clearly see the brass beneath. So this dial blank started like most dials as a brass disc, and it was then plated in silver, and a sunburst finish was applied to that layer of silver. The process for making that sunburst finish requires that the dial be spun in one direction while a brush wheel positioned perpendicular to the disc is rotated in the opposite direction like that. The sub-register is actually a machined finish. It's made up of very tightly stacked concentric circles, and once these finishes are applied, then the printing comes next, and that's applied using a stamp and likely a proprietary ink that's color fast and typically won't run or bleed. When the ink is dry, the dial is then painted and lacquered, both of which are sprayed on in very fine layers. The paint itself can contain lacquer, or they can be applied separately. Of course, after that, heating then seals the lacquer, and the applied markers and badges are riveted in place. If we turn it back over, you can actually see here are the two rivet spots holding the badging in place. Now we'll go back to that silver plating, as it pretty much holds the answer to the question asked back at the beginning of this video. Silver is one of the least reactive elements in the periodic table, all right? It's very stable, and at the moderate air-conditioned temperatures we're used to, it doesn't really react to the two things we'd expect to be the likely culprits of those dark spots: oxygen and water. However, there are plenty of other compounds in the air around us, and a common one is hydrogen sulfide. When hydrogen sulfide meets that silver plating, it will eventually tarnish, and that tarnishing tends to appear as the black rings and points or freckles we sometimes see on these dials. It would make sense then as to why we consistently see this most often around the edge of the sub-register, where that protective lacquer is going to be the thinnest. There's a sharp corner where the sub-register meets the upper dial surface, and the lacquer is thin enough sometimes to allow for that reaction to happen. We also see it sometimes around the markers or the badge, or around the edge of the dial for the same reasons. If the dial becomes scratched in some way and that lacquer surface is compromised, tarnishing will likely develop there as well. This dial belongs to a client servicing this watch, and it really was just such a phenomenal example. I wanted to share it with you as a really textbook, checks all the boxes dial. In fact, there's only a tiny amount of brassing in the sub-register here, but if we do get close, you can really see that sharp edge I was mentioning a moment ago, where the lacquer is almost cut by the sharp edge of the dial there, and you can see a bit of dark or black color there. It doesn't really show up, this is magnified quite a few times, but at using normal eyesight, and while it's on your wrist, you're certainly not going to see any of that degradation in the lacquer finish, but you can see a little bit of the brassiness around the outer edge of the minute track there. But the badging here, there are no issues. This dial has been very well protected pretty much its entire life. Let's take a look at a different dial, and we'll see some better examples of what I was talking about. So this one is going to be from November of 72, pretty close to that other one. You can see some moisture intrusion here has darkened the luminous quite a bit, but there is a definite black ring around that sub-register there. And again, that sharp edge allows that lacquer to become split very easily and allow the compounds in the air, hydrogen sulfide, to cause that natural reaction to darken that silver. At some point, this dial was scratched right through the minute register there, and as you can see, I'll try to get as close as possible, keep it in focus. You can actually see the silver beneath the paint there. That scratch broke the paint, and so there's very dark line around the outer edge of that silver area. But again, once that becomes exposed, that silver is going to darken and tarnish just like it would on silverware or anything else. And along the outer edge of the dial itself, you can see some darkening as well. Since both of the examples we looked at were T dials, I thought I would share an R dial as well because the color is just a bit different, but it really works exactly the same way. You can see that's a little bit, if we compare the two, the T dials are a little more yellow in color, and to my eye, it all depends on lighting as well, but there's a bit more of an orange color to the R dials. Now this is again a phenomenal example. There is really no break in the lacquer around that sub-register. This watch is untouched. It just came to me, and so I've not done anything here, but you can see really just a beautiful dial. I'm going to move that minute hand because I think I did notice, taking a closer look, that along that, let's see if we can spot it, between the 9 and the hands, there's a light scratch on the dial. And if you were to loop that, you could even see there's some very, very, very light darkening there just in that one spot on the dial. Other than that, this dial's pretty much flawless. Beautiful example. But the R dials are not immune to that as well. Here is another T dial. This is, well, that's the one you want to have right there, isn't it? A resist dial. Now, this is a true Pogue, but I wanted to share it with you too because you can really see, like the second dial that we looked at, there is a pronounced dark ring around the edge of that minute register. Still, I would not be upset. This is maybe one that will be available at some point. I don't know. We'll see. But this one had a great example of the oxidation and tarnishing around the outside of the dial there. It's not much, but it does sort of make it look as though that minute track and fifth of a second track is bleeding a bit. Really, it's just darkening from the reaction of silver to hydrogen sulfide. Now, you of course have seen, I'm sure, many examples. Sometimes, as I mentioned, around the badging, because that riveting breaks through the lacquer finish. You will definitely see sometimes around the E or the K that there might be a black spot developing, and again, sometimes I've seen them sort of framing or surrounding the hour markers because they are also riveted. So because that lacquered finish gets punctured, you have the likelihood that if the watch is not sealed up nicely, then those compounds can get in there and cause that silver to react. And as I mentioned, sometimes around the date frame, even though that's sort of epoxied in place, because there's that sharp edge beneath the frame where this frame actually sits in the dial, sometimes you will see that darkening color around the edge of the day-date frame as well. But just some great examples of some yellow Pogues there, and really none that are too bad. Certainly this is going to be our best example of what happens when hydrogen sulfide meets silver plating, and you will get that darkening. Now, again, as I mentioned, this is not due to oxygen or water, so don't let seeing that darkening ring around sub-register be a deterrent for you to maybe not purchase a watch. It does not mean that it's had moisture intrusion or it's not been perfectly sealed its entire life. It's a natural phenomenon that happens as a chemical reaction from silver coming into contact with hydrogen sulfide, and it does not in any way compromise the integrity of the watch. Without that layer of silver, though, this dial wouldn't look nearly as great as it does. It offers a light, highly reflective surface for that delicate yellow paint, and it reflects light as it moves across that sunburst finish. And I can only imagine that the color of the paint would probably look awful over the brass alone, which certainly would create a much darker color and definitely can react to moisture and oxygen alone. Keeping to regular service intervals and maintaining good gaskets so that your watch is properly sealed, that will go a long way in preserving the dial condition of your own watch and help to keep that awesome dial looking its very best for as long as possible. I hope that this has been helpful, and maybe you learned a bit more about your own watch. If so, please like and subscribe, or even consider joining us over at Patreon, where $7 a month gets you access to exclusive content, comprehensive looks at all of our upcoming inventory, which may or may not include at least a couple of these watches from today very soon, as well as becoming eligible for the occasional giveaway, which we're actually gearing up for again very soon as well. But as always, thank you for watching, and we will see you on the next one.